Hey, so welcome back to my channel. I hope you guys are enjoying the recaps. Please leave your comments and suggestions in the comments section if you would like me to present my videos in a different manner. So, moving right along, I'm going to be recapping Netflix, The Haunting of Bly Manor, Season 2, Episode 3. I'm sorry, Season 1. Episode 3, Two Faces, Part 1. But before I get into my recap, I'm going to do a brief recap of Episode 2, The Pupil. So, what did we find out in Episode 2? Dani punches the kid, decides she's going to punish the children by making them do chores, which is a very normal thing, even though some of the staff, like Hannah, did mention further into the episode that she didn't like to see them being punished, but it was necessary based on their behavior, and they did what they were told. Okay, we found out why Miles was expelled, and we also find out that there may have been other motivations for him wanting to be expelled, like he was expelled intentionally. Yes, he was still reeling from the death of their parents and their nanny, but he actually received a letter from Flora that we didn't actually see into the end of the flashback, that basically told him, it was in all caps saying come home. So while he was doing a lot of things that he should not have been doing, it's a strong possibility that those behaviors was in some part influenced by the letter. He wanted to go home, I guess, to make sure that his sister and his family was okay. Hannah's vision, and the reason I'm calling it a vision is because from her point of view, she was sitting in the kitchen and she was looking at the wall, and there was this very noticeable crack in the wall. And when she brought it up to Jamie later, Jamie being the gardener, and I think she does some maintenance work around the property, to go and take a look at it to see if she could patch it up, there was no crack to be found. So you're still up in the air, like, at this point, does Hannah have some psychic ability? Is that why she's so off kilter, at times? And we haven't, like I said, we haven't seen her eat anything. I mean, we see her drink, tea, and she'll sit down and engage, at the table with people, but we haven't actually seen her eat an actual meal. So, obviously, I'm assuming that's going to progress throughout the remaining episodes. We find out that Jamie is not the bitch we thought she was when she was first introduced, when she walked into the kitchen and just sat down and started eating, and she never even acknowledged Dani. So we noticed that when, Dani was having her panic attack after seeing Flora in the glasses that look remarkably similar to the entity, like the shape of the eyes. If you look at the eyes that are glowing on the entity, the glasses kind of look similar to that shape, but whatever the case, it kind of set Dani off, and she kind of left the house very quickly, and it was in the midst of a panic attack when Jamie walked up and kind of talked her through it, and you find out that, okay, maybe Jamie's not such a bitch. Okay, hide and seek, and that's where a lot of the things happen towards the end of the episode. So Dani decides that to reward the kids, they were good, they did what was asked of them all day, they did work hard, and she thought that, okay, bedtime, we're going to play a game, we're going to play hide, and Flora decided it would be hide and seek. And so some of the things that we learned in that episode, Dani ends up finding a music box, and inside that music box she finds a photo of a couple that we at this point know nothing about, but the fact that they zeroed in on it means it's going to be a significant part of the story at some point. While the kids were hiding, Flora was hiding in the attic, and then we find out that there is at least one entity in this house that she is not afraid of, and that was shown by the fact that when the entity started humming and singing way a little too loud, Flora had no problem turning around and basically telling it to shut up, and it obliged her. Miles is starting to look like a psychopath now. Whether or not it's by his own influence or it's because of some influence in the house, I don't know, because it seems like he seems to be like Jekyll and Hyde. So there's a question mark on Miles. And so during the game of hide and seek, while Dani was looking at the music box, he actually snuck up behind her and jumped on her back and was like, okay, I found you, when she was supposed to be looking for them. And then he tightened his grip around her neck and was basically choking her, which prompted her to end the game. So he runs off. She ends the game, and then we find out, okay, she sees the entity of the man again. Now, if you saw it, remember in the first episode when she was walking back with the kids and she saw the man standing on the terrace, she saw him again, and obviously it freaked her out. And then when we found towards the last scene in the episode when they were helping Miles up, Miles actually saw the entity too, and this entity was kind of staring at him and kind of smirking. So, and Miles did look like he was familiar with this individual. So that's basically how the gist of what happened in episode 2. If you're interested in my recap for episode 3, Two Faces Part 1, stay tuned. Okay, so a lot happens in this episode, and there is a lot of flashing back a year ago, which I guess would be 1986, 85, back to present, which would be 1987. Okay, so this episode picks up where the last episode left off, where Dani is, comforting Miles. Miles is still on the floor, but of course, he's sitting up and he's looking at this image, this figure in the window that's staring back at him. And so we go back a year and we see that same image reflecting in a department store window. And so this individual goes in, he picks up a shirt, and then he goes to a liquor store and buy some scotch or whiskey or something, and then he heads to an office, and the person he actually goes to see is Henry Wingrave. And then we realize that, okay, this is where we're introduced to Peter Quint and Rebecca Jessel. So Peter Quint is the guy, he was running these errands for Henry Wingrave. He knew he was going to need a new shirt because he slept at the office, and he bought him the scotch or whatever it is because I think Wingrave is an alcoholic. Whatever the case may be, he knew he had to get him up and get him up to date on what he had to do for that day, namely hiring a nanny. Now, Henry used the word nanny. Peter used the word pair. And so the next thing you see is Peter Quinn going out into the lobby to introduce himself to Rebecca Jessel, and he escorts her in. The thing he noticed on her shirt was there was a stain on her shirt, and so she just moved her hair to cover it, and Peter was like, well, he's going to notice that. Basically, he notices everything. And so she was like, you know what? I'm not worried about it. So he escorts her into the office, and he starts, he's looking over her credentials, and she starts telling him about this big case he just won, the Baker case, and how she read about it. And he's asking her, like, where did you read about it? And she says in the Inquirer or something like that. And maybe that wasn't it. It was a different magazine, publication. And so she starts talking, and in his rude fashion, he cuts her off, and he says, you have a stain. He points out that she has a stain on her top. And she said, well, you said the children are 7 and 9. She said, so, when you're dealing with children that young, I can't be at all particular about, stains on my clothing. And Henry Wingate agreed. So eventually, Peter takes over the interview for some reason. And so they're going back and forth, and he's talking to her about her credentials. Like, you're really overqualified. You're studying to be a lawyer, and, you've worked for all these prestigious companies. And why did you want to do this? And so you can see the chemistry between them. And so she just basically says, like, my whole life is about learning and experiencing something new. And I just see this as an extension of that. And they talked a little bit. And, after the interview, he asked her, Peter asked her if she wanted to be a nanny. And that's when she answered why she wanted to be a nanny. And that's when she answered the question. And so after the interview, it was just Peter and Henry in the office talking. And he said, you said nanny. He was like, oh, did I? I must have made a mistake. He said, no, you never make mistakes, because remember earlier he corrected Henry by saying au pair instead of nanny. And so he was kind of getting at, okay, he could kind of tell that there was more to it. And so we flash to Dani, and she's still looking at this photo of what we now know to be Peter Quint and Rebecca Jessel. And she's actually showing it to the cops. So they're talking to the cops, and she's saying that, Flora told me his name was Peter Quint, and the cops was like, we know who he is. And Hannah was like, he's well known to the cops. And they start talking a little bit, and they shuttle the kids off to bed so they can continue talking to the cops. And Hannah tells Dani that, Peter kind of absconded with over 200,000 pounds of Henry's money a year ago, or last year, or something to that effect. And so the cops are basically telling her that they did a sweep of the property and that they didn't find anything, and that, just to keep the doors locked, and if they see or hear anything else, just to call them. And so as he was walking out, Dani, she wasn't going to let it go. She was like, that's it? And he was like, well, we did the sweep. We don't see anything, so there's really not a whole lot more that we could do. And so as he was walking out the door, Hannah was like, you know what, I'll call Mr. Graves and give him an update and see if he can come up with some solution. So the cop kind of stopped and turned to look at her, and she was like, I know the cop, he works a lot with the police, and he donates, and he does a lot for the police, and he's actually friends with your superior. And so the cops, he really didn't take too kindly to that, but he did say, you know what, I'll do another sweep on my way out. And so they kind of watched him drive off. And so Hannah decides that she's going to call Wingrave, but before she do that, she's going to call Owen and Jamie to see if they'll come to the house to kind of help them keep a lookout, for Peter Quint. And so while she's doing that, Dani's grabbed her jacket and a poker. That poker and a flashlight, and Hannah's like, well, where are you going? She was like, well, I'm going to do my own sweep. Okay, so we flash back to Rebecca Jessel getting in the car. Peter is picking her up, and he's taking her to Bly Manor. And so she's all abuzz and all smiles, and of course, it's the same shot. It's not as green. I'm not sure what time of year it is, but they're taking that long trek down the road. And of course they start talking, and, she was asking him about the and and he said, the children, they're dealing with a lot, but, they kind of weird. He was like, Miles is like a question mark or something's going on with him. And Flora talks to wallpaper. And she was like, well, I'm saying, how are they coping? And, they're doing, the best that they can. And so you see them pulling up to the house. And of course, the first person in the welcome committee is Flora. So she's all excited, and, she's, talking to her and how, she's happy that she's there. And then of course, Miles walk up, and he introduces himself, and he's once again, he's happy, ecstatic that she's there. And no sooner than she can get out of the car and introduce herself to everyone else, Flora pulls her away and was like, would you like to see our statue garden? So she's kind of tugging her and, pulling her on the way. And Hannah's like, well, maybe we should give her a chance to settle in. And Rebecca was like, oh, no, it's fine. And so, of course, she's walking her through the garden, telling her how wonderful it is and, how beautiful it is and the whole thing, Flora being Flora. And so we flash back to Dani. She's in the woods with her flashlight, and she ends up almost getting shot by Jamie, because by this time Jamie is back on the property, and it was close. And so now they decide they're going to walk the property together. They see that there's lights on in the chapel. They go into the chapel. She was like, oh, it must have been Hannah, she's the only one that likes the candles, and she keeps, she must have forgot to blow them out. She's like, one of these days she's gonna burn the place down. So Jamie just blew the candles out, and they left and went back into the house. So the kids they're all at the table, and they're basically saying they didn't find anything, and the kids are like, oh, why don't we? Oh, I think they agreed to stay. Jamie and Owen agreed to stay overnight, and so the kids are all excited, like, oh, you know, it'll be a slumber party, it'll be a sleepover, it'll be great, da 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 da, and they're just all hyped up, right? All this energy. And so Flora, she looks over at Hannah and was like, you're not drinking your hot chocolate, can I have it? And Hannah's like, no, you know, if you drink my hot chocolate, then you're gonna be too buzzed to go to bed. She was like, oh, you know, I'm just too excited, and you know, everything is perfectly splendid, right? And she's all hiding the drink. The next thing you see her, both of them are knocked out, right? So they're all sitting around and they're talking about, obviously, Peter Quinn. And they start talking about the prank phone calls, and maybe it's been him the whole time. And I believe it was Owen who mentioned, Owen had mentioned that it may have been him doing the prank calls. Maybe he's calling to talk to Rebecca. And Jamie was like, why would he call to talk to a dead person? And Owen was like, well, maybe he doesn't know that she died. So clearly he left before whatever happened to Rebecca happened. So he starts talking, talking about what that would be like to find out that somebody you love died. It was a whole conversation, and then Jamie chimes in. Is like, I wouldn't want to be the person in the room when he finds out, if it is Peter Quinn, when he finds out that Rebecca died. And so they all kind of Hannah has this concerned look on her face, and it's just the awkward moment, right? And so we flash back to Jessel, and she's now playing with the dolls with Flora. And of course, Miles, being who he is, he's like, oh, dolls are stupid. And of course, Rebecca's like, no, they're not. You can give them all kinds of names and pretend to give them all kinds of stories. And Flora, in her serious face, is like, they're not made up. And so there's a knock at the door, and and God, I just had a brain fart. And Peter walks in with these beautiful roses. And I thought back, and I'm like, wait a minute, that looks almost like the same arrangement that Miles gave Dani when he apologized to her. But he came in, and they started talking, and of course Flora's like, oh, those are beautiful flowers, and she's just being her normal self. And he's like, well, why did you bring flowers? And he said, I thought I'd bring this for the most beautiful girl in the world. And you kind of see Rebecca perk up, and then he was like, to you, Flora. So he gave the flowers to Flora, right? And she was all like, oh, thank you. And of course she's just being Flora, and she ends up giving a red rose to Rebecca. And so they walk out, to go put the flowers in water. And Miles is like, I don't understand why Flora gets so crazy about over flowers. And he's talking to Miles, and he's saying, basically it's about finding a person's key. And that came up a couple of times, and I didn't really understand what it meant, but now I get where they got it from. And he was like, keys? He said, what do you mean? And basically he was saying, you basically have to find what makes that person tick. He was like, so in your uncle's case, it's money and flattery. And he's saying for most women, it's flowers. So that was basically his lesson to Miles, just finding out what motivates a person to do the things that they do. And so he was like, so wait a minute, so then why did you give the flowers to Flora? And then he was like, I didn't, not really. And so we see it's storming really bad out, and Peter is packing to go back to London, and Rebecca walks in and basically invites him to stay for tea, and he agreed to stay. And they start talking, and he is asking her how she's coping, how things are working. And she was like, and she mentioned the muddy footprint. She was like, it happens twice a week. So this whole issue with the footprints was happening even before Rebecca got there. And so he starts talking to her. So I mean, no, what I mean is you're, living in a mansion and you have these servants. This whole thing. She was like, I'm hardly lady of the manor. She was like, I had to clean up vomit off of my shirt early. And she kind of chuckled a little bit. And he got serious and was like, I don't think that's funny. And she turned around with this serious look like, what? He was like, for you to have the intelligence and the drive that you have, you don't feel like, this is, basically he was asking her, you don't think this is beneath you? And he was like, basically asking her, why are you really here? And so she basically told him that she wants to be a barrister. And in order for that to happen, she has to be someone's pupil, I guess, for a certain amount of time. And she was saying her experience in these companies, even though she's worked for some prestigious companies, is that it's older men always trying to put their hands up your skirt. They're more interested in what's between your legs and what's between your ears. And he was like, okay, so, you saw this ad and basically you have this man who is single and you have, basically this was an opportunity for her to attach herself to a man who's basically in a position that she wants to be in. So it's really not about the kids. It's about her basically meeting her life goals, which is to be a barrister. And so he was like, you know what? I knew it when I saw you. And he was like, he basically was talking to her. He's like, I see you. I see you. I kind of got that when I saw your resume and I met you. And so now they're sitting in the living room or the sitting room or whatever. And she asked him, okay, so why are you really here? And he was like, well, what do you mean? Like, why am I here on Earth? Why am I here in this job? What do you mean? And so he basically said that why I'm here on Earth is to make the place better than it was before I came. Why I'm working in this job is because, although it might not look like it, I do I do find myself hitting a glass ceiling as well. And so, him attaching himself to Henry Wingrave also is a win for him as well. And he's basically saying that where he's from, he doesn't really fit in. And so, they're talking and he said, but now he's hopeful. And you can really see the chemistry between them. And then he decides, that maybe it's best that he go. And he jumps up to grab his coat and to leave. And he's like, oh, it's died down a little bit. And so, that he left. They said their goodbyes and he left. And so we flash back to current day. Hannah has fallen asleep on Owen's shoulder, and then she wakes up and realizes, she's like, oh my God, I am so sorry. These last few nights I have not, I guess a few weeks, I have not slept well. And he was like, oh, that's perfectly fine. And he, told her she could just, sleep today as long as she wants. So she put her head back on his shoulder and, and she went back to sleep. So while this is going on, you got Dani and Jamie, they're sitting across from them, and Jamie leans over to whisper to Dani and was like, honestly, that should be you. And so she said all the girls in the town are crazy about him, and and he's like oblivious to it, right? He said she said that I think that's really sad. And so Dani she's focused still on this daggone picture of Peter and Rebecca. And Jamie basically was telling her that sometimes you find the wrong kind of love. And she said those two was definitely the wrong kind of love. Like he kind of entwined himself into her, and people mistake obsession with love. And I think that's what happened with them. And so Dani turns to her, and you know what? I do think that that's true, that people can mistake obsession with love. And there's just something in her eyes. I think Dani was like, okay, there's clearly a story. We know that, but I don't know if Dani was catching that or whatever. But so they eventually decide that they need to get the kids up to their beds, get them in bed so they can get a restful night's sleep. And so they leave. They all, the three women, Dani, Hannah, and Jamie, get the kids up and get them into bed. So next thing you see, Dani, she's in bed, and there's, you see the rain hitting the windows, and she's kind of looking at the window, and then it kind of then you kind of see Rebecca in the same room, because it's the same, they're in the same room. And it's also raining, and she's looking out of that same window. And so they flash back to Dani, and she initially was looking at the glasses on the nightstand, and then she turns over, and then her facial expression changed. You can tell that she's seeing something that she really does not want to see. And what she sees is this mangle of this bruised hand that's just there shaking, and she's about on the verge of having a panic attack. So you see her, she closes her eyes, she takes a couple of deep breaths, and she opens her eyes, and nothing's there. So they flash back, and they have the kids, and they're playing cards with Rebecca. And you can tell she's just tired, like she's kind of over it. And so they started getting into a fight over the card game. Peter walks in. Of course, Flora walks over and says how happy she is to see him, and brings him into the room. And they talked a little bit, and he's saying that he's going to be there for a couple of days to take care of some business for their uncle. And eventually Miles asked him about their uncle, if he's going to come. And of course the answer was no. So you can see he felt kind of down. And so Peter, started talking to him about, how he lost his own dad, and, how his father wasn't very good, but he did leave him this lighter that he always see Peter with. And he ended up giving it to Miles, and just like, can you just take care of this for me, and please try not to burn the house down. So they all kind of laughed a little bit, and of course she was happy to see him, and he joined the card game. So later that night, Rebecca's in her room. You can hear creaking floorboards. So she got up and opened the door, and of course Peter is standing there at her bedroom, and he's like apologizing, like, I'm so sorry, I'm here, I don't know why I'm here. And of course she grabs him, and of course they spend the night together. So the following morning is present day, and Dani gets up, she goes to get her a cup of tea or coffee or whatever, and then you see Jamie, she's asleep on the couch. Hannah, she's in the chapel saying her prayers, and she looks up and she sees that exact same crack that she saw in the kitchen, in the kitchen wall. And she's briefly interrupted by Owen. Owen came in to see how she was doing, to see what was going on, and to say that he's decided he's going to stay another night just to make sure that they're okay. And she tried to talk him out of it, like, what about your mom? And he was like, oh well, she's fine, it's just one more night. And so they speak. It was awkward silence for a while, and he left. And then she turned back around, and you see her facial expression change. And then you look at the wall, and the crack is no longer there. So it's like, okay, what is it about this crack that keeps appearing and reappearing for her? And so Dani, she goes into the room to start getting the kids up so they can get ready, to start their day. But Mouse is already up and dressed, and he's like, I think it's a wonderful day for a picnic, and as soon as you find Flora, then it'd be lovely to the whole thing in the picnic. And so she's like, what do you mean find Flora? She's not in her room. So she goes into the room, her bed. I mean, she clearly slept in the bed, but Flora is nowhere to be found. And then they flash back to Flora and Rebecca sitting by the lake. And when they were playing with the dolls, she did say that she would make a doll for Rebecca. Rebecca. And so she gave Rebecca the doll. And of course she was very ecstatic and happy about it. And you can see in the background that Peter's playing catch with Mouse, and she and Rebecca was telling her how beautiful the doll was, and Flora was telling her how beautiful she is, and she said, even Peter thinks so. I heard him say it. And he stayed the night, then, don't you? And so she turned, and she was like, yeah, it was nice to have him around, and he kind of was looking back at her. And then we flashed to present day. Flora is just standing there at the lake, and she's looking at something. We don't know. And Dani walks up and grabs her, and now she's fighting her like, no, no, no. So she ends up having to pick her up and carry her away. And then they flash to what she's actually seeing. And it appears that she's looking at Rebecca standing on the other side of the lake. So now they've called the doctor. The doctor is taking her temperature and basically saying that, you know, she doesn't have a fever or anything. And that, you know, you could tell Mr. Wingate that they're perfectly fine. And so they said, well, are they fine? He was like, well, I mean, physically they're fine. And that's the only thing that I can attest to. I'm not, you know, he's not a mental health professional. So he's saying, but if there's any other issues, then just let me know. And we flash back to the next morning after they spent the night together. And of course they're talking and the whole thing, and she eventually gets up and she has to get dressed. Obviously she got to get the kids together. So Owen and Hannah are in the kitchen. She's helping him put the food away. She was like, oh, it's going to be 7 for dinner. And they were asking like, well, how long is he going to stay? And she was like, I don't know. Said a couple of days. And the next you know, he placed a bottle of wine on the table and asked him if they want some. It's a good vintage. And then she asked him, you asked him if he was in the cellar. And he said, yeah, but it's fine. Mr. Wingrave doesn't care. And so he was like, I'll save you some if you want. And so he grabs takes the bottle and 2 glasses, and he walks on away. So you can tell that they don't really care for him, right? So he's now taking Rebecca to the forbidden area of the house. And while they're walking down the hall, she could see these muddy footprints. And she was like, oh, these kids and these footprints. And he's not focused on that. He's trying to get into this room, right? And so he has her eyes covered because he has a surprise for her. And so he leads her to the couch and he opens her eyes and she sees this fur coat. And she's like, well, what is this? He was like, oh, well, you know, it's fine for you to, you could have that. Mr. Wingrave said it was fine, even though I don't really believe that. I'm responsible for basically cataloging and auctioning some of this stuff off. And, you know, that's your coat now. And so and that's when, you know, he lifts the music box and the music is playing. This is the same music box that she found in the previous episode. And she's about to put the fur coat on, and he was like, well, no, you have to feel it against your skin. And so she takes her shirt and her bra off, and now she's wearing just this fur coat. And so he pulls out the Polaroid camera. Side note, I was in Walmart not too long ago, and they actually have Polaroid cameras in there, and those Polaroid cameras were over $100, and I was just blown away. I'm like, who would pay $100 for a Polaroid camera? So, okay, got the Polaroid going, and he's snapping photos of her. They start getting into it, but the thing is, what you find out is this is where they took that photo. So they all about to get down with the get down. Hannah walks in and basically tells her the kids are in the front yard and basically you need to go and see about them. So she gets up to go out and she's like, you should probably get your shirt first. So Dani grabs her shirt and then she walks out. And Hannah begins to, she tells him, that this part of the house is forbidden. And then he basically threatens to see that if she says anything that he could have her fired. And she was like, you know what, at this point I really don't care. Like, how dare you take Charlotte's things, which I'm assuming is the parents, the mom, and you're going through her things, and if I ever see you in here again, I'm going to drag you out by your ears and throw you in the lake myself. And then she tells him that clean this stuff up, dinner is ready. And so he kind of sits there for a while with this serious look on his face. He's such a jerk. And then, so we flash to the kitchen. So Owen is making this cake, and he's trying to get a taste test. So do he needs to add more strawberries? Do he need to add more lemon? And so Flora wants him to add more lemon. Miles wants him to add more. Flora wants him to add more strawberry. Miles wants him to add more lemon. And so he's now going around having everybody taste this batter to figure out what to get a consensus on what people want. Now the whole time you can see in the corner here at this photo, Peter, he's just standing there. He's not involved at all. He's just standing there watching, basically staring at Rebecca while she's helping Hannah set the table. And so they're going around, and I think Jamie came in and she wanted to add more strawberry, and Dani tasted it, and I forget what her choice was. And I think Hannah was like, "It's perfect the way it is." I think maybe, and then Peter ends up being the tiebreaker or whatever. And so I guess they eventually end up adding more strawberry. And so that was the whole thing. It was just something fun for the kids, right? And so after dinner, after she got the kids to bed, she comes into her room, and he's packing, and she's like, "Well, what are you going?" He said, "I'm going back to London." And she's confused, like, "Well, what happened?" She was like, "Well, you seem to be doing pretty good here. You don't have a problem like mixing it in with them." And she's confused, like, "Well, what do you mean?" He was asking, you have no problem opening your mouth whenever someone tells you. He was just really crass and crude, and the fact that she tasted the batter and the way that she did it, and I thought you were different, and it's nice to know that, nice to know that if a man asks you to open your mouth, you will. And she was just completely confused and befuddled and confuzzled and anything else you could think of. And he walks out and he slams the door. And so we have this photo again. Dani, going back to present day, Dani is staring at this photo, and Jamie is staring at her, looking at this photo like, "Why are you obsessed with this photo?" The phone rings, and she says Peter, and the person hangs up. And so the kids come into the kitchen, and they're talking about, "Oh, it's story time," and they're like, "Oh, okay, story time." Okay, so they go out, and they start, they all, Hannah, Jamie, and Owen, just like, "Oh, this is your first story time." He said they do this a lot. And so as they're walking out, Jamie's the last person, so she grabs the entire bottle of wine, right? So now they're sitting, so now they got the chair set up, they're sitting, and they're on the steps, and they're, doing their little part, and, of course, Miles had to have the more dramatic part. He's talking about he's a puppet, and his name is Puppet, and his maker makes like 20 puppets, and they all have different personalities and different characteristics. And then the puppet maker went away, and then the puppet, and he came back, and then the puppets, didn't know him anymore, and they just laughed and laughed and laughed. And he's kind of like, his voice started, there's inflections in his voice, and then it actually made them jump, and they turned to look at him, and then the phone rang. And it was so funny because Owen was like, "Oh, thank God for Peter Quint," right? Because it was an awkward moment. They're kind of like, "What the hell is wrong with him?" And so Jamie answers the phone and was like, "Peter, she's dead." And then she kind of got serious. It was like, "Oh, okay." And so she says, "Owen, I am so sorry. It's your neighbor. It's about your mom." And so you get from that his mom passed away. And so they, see him off. And, Jamie and Dani walks Jamie to her truck, and I don't know, is there something between Dani and Jamie? Like, are they like feeling each other? I mean, I kind of got that the way Jamie was staring at her when they were sitting on the couch talking about like how just toxic relationships, and when she was staring at her when they were sitting at the table, when Dani was still staring at this photo. And now the way that, the way this scene ended, I'm like, are we gonna find out that Dani and Jamie are, have feelings for each other? And I don't know. And so, but she saw her off, and Dani saw Jamie off, and as soon as she turns around, she sees this entity. Now I'm like, oh, okay, so it's not just stuck in a reflection anymore, because she, will cover the mirror so she can see him. Now, whatever this thing is standing right in front of her out in the open. And then the next thing you know, it's sucked into the house. She screams, and that's how this episode ends. So, like I said, there was a lot that happened. There was a lot of back and forth. We did get to see, Peter Quinn and Rebecca Jessel, and kind of get some, the motive, what, kind of motivated them. Now, why he flashed on her like that is anybody's guess. I mean, I guess you can go back to when Jamie was talking about people mistake obsession with love and that whole thing. But that was just absolutely weird. But you know what? I'm going to end this here, and I will talk to you guys later.